we are here today to do an interview with two of the folks in the counseling and psychology field that have been instrumental in moving us to become more multiculturally conscious and hopefully competent as well. And so I'm Allison McCann. I'm chair of the counseling department at Springfield College, and I will let the others introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Michael DeAndrea. I'm an associate professor here at Springfield College.
Good afternoon. I'm Patricia Arredondo and one of the co-authors of the Multicultural Counseling Competencies documents, and currently working in the space of organizational consulting, focusing on cultural competency development in universities.
So we're just going to have a conversation and ask some questions. Can I throw the first question?
Yeah,
is that all right?
Great.
So I clearly remember as a doctoral student learning the multicultural competencies. They were pretty fresh off the presses. And I remember thinking they were lofty and having a real sense of hope that helped channel the work that I wanted to do in the field. And so I know that both of you were instrumental in that work and in shaping our field in that way. So could you kind of speak to what that process was like, coming up with them in a time that wasn't probably completely open, and then maybe start with that.
Good.
And follow up.
Sure. I'd love to take that on. I would say the timing is never perfect when it comes to advancing the multicultural counseling competencies, but the whole space, because even at the time, which is the early 90s, we were hearing from people that would say all counseling is good counseling, and what's this business about multicultural competencies? However, we did have one of the many visionaries, Paul Peterson, who indicated that we were now the fourth force of counseling was multiculturalism, and he said that and wrote about it in 1988. And that was important because Paul was always an ally, and as a white man, I think his role in our work was always a bit of ahead of the curve, if you would. I always thought Paul was ahead of the curve. But we had the opportunity through the Association of Multicultural Counseling and Development, under the leadership of Thomas Parham at the time, who was president, to he commissioned us to work on the development of this document of multicultural counseling competencies and standards. And it just in terms of a little narrative, but the scene, we were at an ACA conference somewhere, and he said to me and Daryl Wing-Soo, how about if we meet at the bar at a certain hour? And there we were, and he said, I want you guys to do this. He was president-elect of AMCD, and said, I'd like you guys to take the document that Alan Ivey worked on with Daryl back in 1982, and I want you to update it in a year. And there were three of us, Daryl, myself, and Roderick Davis, who was the dean at the University of Florida at the time. And as they say, we got the work done and brought the document to AMCD. It was published in two journals. It was published in the Journal of Counseling and Development, and then the Journal of Multicultural Counseling and Development. So that's the big impetus, 1992. And I think things started to stir up because then we were able to move in 1996. When you talked about this being lofty, Allison, I think a lot of people thought they were lofty in the sense of, what do you guys talk about? You're out of your space, and who needs this? There were 31 standards and competencies, but people said, well, we don't know how to do this. How do we implement these? And that led to the development of the 1996 document, Operationalization of Multicultural Counseling Competencies, with 119 explanatory statements of how to operationalize the 32. Oh, I would say that journey, when you think about the time, when Thomas told us to start writing, it would have been 91 to 96. We're only talking about 5 years of really cranking it out and pushing it out into the counseling world. Oh, that time was very intense and led to a lot of the work then that I'm sure that Michael will comment about as well.
And I want to kind of piggyback on what you're saying, because at that time, the late 80s, early 90s, and when Thomas Barham asked you and Ron McDavis and Daryl Sue to complement what Paul Peterson has done, and yes, he was an ally of ours, but truly, when history is written about that epic, you and Paul and Daryl Sue and Rodney were visionaries, which had a clear kind of roadmap in mind, and you talked about that in your presentations. And what you did was to shift the paradigm in concrete terms with the articulation of 31 central competencies that, to my research, are the most widely referenced competencies in counseling, psychology, and other allied professions. So I want to emphasize the visionary characteristics that you brought to the table. And as a paradigm shift, it really was revolutionary. And it helped us unchain ourselves from the impediments of institutional racism, because you're right, people were saying, good counseling is good counseling, and you can apply it to all people, but the research on good counseling was only done with white males predominantly. And so I recall as a young professional kind of making my way through the multicultural movement, some of the things that were said, and these are revolutionary changes in a paradigm shift going on. And Patricia, I remember all of us working together with the National Institute of Multicultural Competence that, emerged out of that era. We were not met with friendly reactions to the competencies and what went on. As a matter of fact, I remember writing about the criticism about why don't they operationalize this? Well, as we know, sex counseling, substance abuse counseling, marriage and family counseling did not have operationalized terms. And so, to your credit, between 91 and 96, 100 plus operational, and that was such a contribution to REACT. But again, I want to go on record historically to say, we were met with hostility, open hostility in various settings, and it's a real tribute, and I would give that to you, the Ivies, Mary and Alan Ivy, and Paul Peterson, and Judy Daniels, and Daryl Wing-Soo, and other allies in the field, that we were able to stay strong, because it was an emotionally draining. And I wonder if you see it in that way.
Well, I know it was emotionally draining, because even within the Association of Multicultural Counseling and Development, we had some pushback. Because some individuals thought that this was almost the property of AMCD, and now it was going to be widely shared. And fortunately, not the majority of people thought that way. So that was one group where we had a little pushback. I think there were a lot of other things coinciding at the time, as a matter of fact, which made it, I think, a much more compelling, and at times compelling to keep doing this, because within AMCD we were trying to have an interest group for Indigenous people, and we had to find, according to the bylaws, 75 people who said they were Indigenous. Well, I remember a number of us walking around an AMCD meeting, an ACA meeting, saying, okay, Michael DeAndrea, do you have some Indigenous heritage? So honest to goodness, anybody who we knew who might have Indigenous heritage and who owned it, they owned it, and they said, yeah, signed up. Okay, so we were able to get the votes, but that was also part of the multicultural conversation, was indicating to the organization that we had to up our game about being culturally sensitive, culturally competent, and inclusive. And that to me was always a reminder of how much work we as professionals always have to do. Because we can have the documents and they say, well, that's for the students, well, these Adventist students, but that awareness, knowledge, and skills applies to us. So yeah, that was one area of pushback, and I think counselor educators also pushed back on us. They, the majority of counselor educators are not prepared in multicultural counseling, as one simple example at the time. This was the mid-90s.
Well, the Association
Right.
for Counselor Educators and Supervisors, ACES, was not supportive until we had to use interesting organizational change strategies that kind of encouraged them to take action. But you said something just a second ago. That time was special, in the early 90s. And if we look at the history of the multicultural movement, the 60s and 70s were between group differences and building an empirical base to demonstrate, no, African Americans have a different worldview, a different way, and then Latinos, and then persons of Asian descent, indigenous descent. And then in the 80s and 90s, it was the move towards looking at within group differences to avoid the stereotyping that was starting to creep in. And then in the 90s and 2000, people like Mark Pope and others were writing about, let's not call it a melting pot, let's call it a salad. And that's when gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender persons were saying, wait a minute, we need to have a place at the table. And persons who had religious beliefs, we need to have, and so it was an interesting time where the whole multicultural concept began to really expand. And I think it was fortunate at that time.
And I think that's a really good observation, because it's like the civil rights movement, okay, which said, you know, you can no longer discriminate against people of color in education, employment, housing, and so forth. The competencies really were about inclusion, and then I think it turned on the light bulb for many I guess disenfranchised members of ACA to say, wow, you know, let's form the Association of Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, Transgender formed. Shortly thereafter, the Counselors for Social Justice formed. I think it really was a springboard for many other identity groups, I guess like the social identity groups. And we had the first, and this was an ACA group that continues, a multiracial interest network that was formed at that time. And even though this may have predated all of that in the 80s, I was part of a group that formed the ACES Women's Interest Network in 1985, and then ACA I think now has a women's ACA Women's Network. So all of those, that era of the multicultural movement, or you know, that really I think propelled others to think about, what about me?
Good point. Really good point.
And went forward.
So we're now 20-some years into that. What do you see as the challenges that continue or lie ahead? If you were to rewrite them, or how would it look different, and what would you say is the challenges that continue?
Well, there's new language we could certainly consider in the in an update or a revision. You know, where in the awareness part of it, we weren't using the terms of unconscious bias, for example. We had Donna Ridley's book, Ridley, and I can't remember who he co-authored with, but he talked about prejudice, right? And we didn't talk very much about it in the 92 document, because I think his work came out a little later.
That's right.
So there are some other constructs that are particularly relevant to the competencies in the awareness and knowledge, just talking about those two spaces. And we did introduce the dimensions of personal identity in the 96 version as a way of addressing the intersecting identities, intersecting social identities, because that was another, some feedback that I was given, that well, where's the women's voice in here?
Mhm.
How are women going to be acknowledged? And because they said everything's about race and ethnicity, and I understood that, and the model, of course, talks about gender differences, sexual orientation, SES, and disability. So there's a way we had to, and rightly so, broaden that. And I'm not sure, Allison, how widely the model is used. Because I think some people stick with the 92
Mhm.
and don't go to the 96, which is where that model was published. But I think we have to do, without saying we have to go only into, we have to, I think, demonstrate further how all of these things intersect religion
Mhm.
and
Yes.
spirituality, okay,
And you
class.
A lot of your work has involved, along with Daryl and Thomas and the Ivies, looking at organizational, institutional change. And with the last 10 years, I think there's been a dramatic increase in institutional racism as being a pathology in society that needs to be addressed. We might kick that into the whole scenario. And at one time in psychology and counseling, the two topics not to be discussed, I'm talking socially. Do you remember what they were, the two topics we were taught never to discuss?
Besides religion?
Yeah, besides
Politics.
religion, politics, right?
Yeah.
Now, in the last 25 years, the research has shown that religion plays a pretty intimate role in
Huge,
mental health
huge,
and
yeah.
mental disorders, and so now we're embracing the religious dimension. And I think it makes us better
Wonderfully.
as a profession.
Well, absolutely, because plenty of identity groups, their faith, their religion is an anchor for them.
Yeah.
How could you go into counseling and say, I don't want to know about religion? Because that's
Such a central part.
where that person's identity, that person's belief system, how they live their life.
Yeah.
You can't
It
ignore
can lead to some challenges though, right? Because when we talk about some of the intersectionality, where religion may not leave you open and accepting to other marginalized groups. And that I think that's a huge conversation for us as counselor educators.
Oh,
That
absolutely.
I don't know that there's an easy answer. I don't know that we're any closer to finding that.
Well, I remember a few years ago, it was a case, I think it was in Michigan. And the student would not see a client
Yes, because of religious beliefs.
because of religious beliefs and did not get supported in the courts. So that is not the slope you want to walk down, or if you want to be part of a CAPREC accredited program, for example, I don't think that would play out.
So religion really has taken a center stage.
Oh, I think
But
so.
the one thing that we're still having the veil to be pulled off of is politics. And you've done such an important work with looking at organizational and aligned with societal changes going on. And to me, it's not a holistic approach to healthy human development to keep politics on the sideline. Obviously, what's going on now in society being so divisive. But I've written a couple of things about the whole idea of people at the border. And as a nonviolent peace activist, right? I often think if I was standing there with my child in my arms and a police officer stripped me of my child, that'd be an awful big test for violence. And if I look at the level of racism, I don't think it's increasing. I think it's being unveiled. I think it was always there and we're unveiling it. But the whole statements that are made, the obscenities, the violence in these mass killings, predominantly white males. I think part of that's connected with this fear and anxiety of this demographic transformation of our society, where for the first time in our history, we're moving to a majority of people coming from non-white backgrounds going on here. The silence in our organizations in terms of dealing with or not dealing with the epidemic of violence with women, the impact of poverty, the continued negative impact of evangelical persons against gay and lesbian, the silence about the immigration, the ongoing militarization of our society. To me, something has been lost in the revolutionary potential of the multicultural movement that we saw headed up by you and other colleagues in the field. And I'm wondering if you see that going on. In other words, in universities, there is no way a faculty member who's operating at the immersion stage, who has a lot of resentment of white racism in society and carries that as part of his or her persona, would get a job in a faculty position. That voice needs to be heard. I wonder if you can comment on that, if you see it the same way.
Well, it's a very timely comment, because when Rebecca Toporek, a colleague, and I started writing the 25th anniversary article on the multicultural counseling competencies, and did a huge review of the literature. And there was a lot of research done on our 92 and 96 competencies, but it stopped. And it didn't deepen, let me put it that way either, it didn't deepen. So there's something amiss there, Michael. I think that's data about, did people lose interest, or
what's your hypothesis? Why was there a dip from your perspective?
My hypothesis is that the faculty who were driving this kind of research were no longer driving it, or were gone to some other institution. Okay? Number two, there were more new things coming in. Social justice came in, and that's an important topic. There were more literature, if you look at the counseling ACA and JMCD, more what I would call mainstream articles about, it could be everything from trauma, which is all very important work, but it doesn't. I think one of my biggest criticisms of a lot of the research is it really doesn't reference cultural competencies. And it doesn't say or indicate how culture plays a role, for example, in trauma. Right. How people respond to trauma based on cultural knowledge or upbringing and so forth. And whenever whether it's with ACA or with the APA multicultural guidelines, I see all this research, they don't make any mention of culture. So I think part of it is people are onto other things and really never got the culture piece, multicultural piece. Second is, I think the editors of these journals are
it's like window dressings almost. I haven't written much at all in my dissertation. When I put it out for publication, it was funny because it was Michael Arredondo. I said, "Will you help me with some of the stats?" So I put them on my paper, and when we got it back, it was, the comments were unreal. They were scathing. They were attacking. What do you know? Awful comments. Well, I thought that was my whole experience, because I've been writing about white racism in 1998. Like we should have been there. And really critically looking, and I was at that point in the field of rehab. I thought it was normal. I never wanted to publish again. I never wanted to go into R1 because of that. And the only way I had a lens that it wasn't was that he wrote with me and was horrified. He got the edits back, and back then they were paper, and just couldn't believe that somebody would talk to us like that.
Wow. Well, that complements your hypothesis.
Yeah. So anything that was below, and then the edits were just, put out your results. We don't want to speculate that these people are racist. Well, they are. And they said they were. They said they were. It was self-report data too. It wasn't even. So I think why are these interesting gatekeepers? And again, for me, there was a quieting of folks, and I'm a white woman. I probably have I have access to privilege and maybe a louder voice, but it was really, really frustrating and demoralizing. I remember thinking that that this was a bit of a farce. What the heck is going on? And if it weren't for Mike, who read it and said, no, this isn't normal. I just thought that's how editors talk to writers. And I thought, that's nice. I don't want to play that game. But I stopped playing the game. I didn't have the strength to accommodate it.
But think of the important research that got lost.
And if that happened to me, I know it. I think that's the other layer.
Yes.
I know there were countless other people, women, folks of color, who just didn't.
And anyone doing research in that space, because generally your editor and your reviewers didn't get it,
That's
didn't
right.
understand it,
That's right.
therefore they were not going to support it. They, it was like telling someone you can't study white racism. It doesn't exist.
That's right.
I mean,
Yeah.
if you had a dissertation advisor,
That's right.
he or she might say that to you.
Yeah.
You can't
Well, the
study
two of you were involved in not only women's rights and women's movements and organization, but both of you are models for me in terms of looking at how to move it to the next level and next direction. And perhaps we can talk a little bit about the direction in the future, but I'm wondering if the two of you, I mean, we talked last night when we were together about people put in positions with good, solid understanding of psychological liberation, social justice, and mental health going on. And they have to be at times yes people to go along with organization, even though they're contradicting their own values that's going on. So I'm wondering, if we look at people like, is there room, is there a need for Malcolm X? Is there a need for Black liberation struggles that include the Black Panther Party? Are there people who are radical feminists that need to be promoted and need to be voiced, and we need to model these sort of militant leaders that really turn the page in civil rights in the 60s, and people paid the ultimate price for that. Is there a place for these persons in the multicultural social justice movement in the 21st century?
Well, without a doubt, I think society's become so complex, as we know.
Yep.
We talked about it before, and I remember the 92 competencies, one of the statements, and I think Daryl wrote it in the other document, was, psychology and counseling being handmaidens of the status quo. I've always liked that line.
Me too.
And I think we can continue to be handmaidens of the status quo or continue to shake it up, because it is a complex world we're preparing students to enter as professionals. And we have to talk about the socio-political climate in which they're being educated, and which they will be doing their practice. And short of that, they'll never be culturally responsive, because it's going to be the micro scale conversation, which does not broaden the understanding of how much the ecology of your environment affects your mental health,
Yes.
your mental well-being.
Yeah.
That you're not going out of your mind when you are feeling somebody walking behind you in the store, or the woman who was shot in Dallas over the weekend in her own home. I mean, that to me is a real situation that someone else in that neighborhood or someone else would say, me too. That had happened to me too,
Yes.
just because of I'm African American.
And I think that incident, we just saw the trial for the fellow that was shot sitting in his living room, and we celebrated that she was found guilty. A woman walked into a man's apartment and shot him. So we have had this, I think social media has increased our awareness. I think these are things that probably have happened and been covered up or hidden. But there is a level of fear and trauma within the African American community now that the woman that drove me to the airport in Seattle said, I worry about my son after that happened. We used to say, just get home safely. So there's this level that
you
don't
don't have
understand
control.
that trauma.
Yeah, and you don't have control over that situation. The woman's in her own home.
Babysitting an 8-year-old. Babysitting.
Well, you just said something that's really profound. I don't want to lose track of it. You were talking about the social political venue that we live in, that unless people understand that, they're never, I think you said, never going to be culturally competent or culturally responsive going on. You got a lot of attention at some point, which really made me pay attention to and respect you even more than I had. And that was, you made a statement, you probably remember this, saying all counseling is political. You remember saying that?
Yeah.
And people still reference that point when they're talking about, politics should not be part of our discourse in the multicultural movement. I wonder if you could comment on your own memories or how you reacted to that.
I think I was in so many spaces that people wanted to do all counseling is good counseling that I was up to here. And then, Daryl's statement about the status quo, I thought, no, everything we do is political. Everything you do, your choices are political. And in counseling, we were studying only the male theorists, remember that, okay? Those are, you could say that was all there was, but there wasn't, because we had other people already in the field that were doing important work,
Yes.
whether it was Don Locke or other people we know. But those textbooks did not become mainstream textbooks. And even Daryl's book is a multicultural counseling book, right?
Yeah.
So I think in terms of theory development, as one example, the theory development is still standing on the shoulders of the Eastern European white men who, died many long years ago, and it's the medical model still.
Well,
It's the pathology model.
I think you're familiar with relational cultural theory,
cultural
Dana
relational.
Comstock and the folks up at the
Wellesley
Stone Center,
Center,
right? And for me, I'm using that textbook this semester in our human development course. And it's such a diversion from the traditional counseling theories emphasizing mutual empathy and looking at controlling images they talk about and how that underlies a lot of the problems that we face. It hasn't caught on, the RCT.
And that's a very good point. We talked about it at lunch today, and we were looking at women's leadership. And Jean Baker Miller was the one who talked about RCT. She was the one who started that, and then her team. And I think you make a very good point. We probably have to resurrect it to a level of more dominance in the field. And if Dana's is the only book out there that promotes this theoretical framework, then I think the other part, here's what I think is another part, Michael, is with the cultural relational, that could very readily be linked to the multicultural counseling competencies.
Yes.
And to really show that embedded in the paradigm of becoming more culturally competent is the social relational aspect.
Gosh, that's a good point. And
That's how
and it's a good matchup. They talk about, and I'm learning about it as I'm teaching this course, relational competencies. And so when you all are talking about, and I'm talking you, Daryl, and Thomas, and Rodney, awareness, knowledge, and skills. Well, the awareness we can kick in with looking at RCT, relational, cultural things. I think it's a perfect fit.
I think it is a very good fit. The other model that I've now brought into the MCCs is emotional intelligence, because there are the 4 stages of emotional intelligence, and they line up right here with the MCCs in terms of self-awareness, emotional management, and so forth. It's perfect alignment. So let's not say the MCCs have no theoretical foundation. I mean, they always did, but I think to further look at how some of these other constructs intersect, I think will give us a more, even greater latitude, because you can't do EI without cultural competency. You can't do RCT without cultural competency.
So what do you see as the biggest challenges facing our field?
I think, number one, I think that for us to shake things up is that the emergence of the Me Too movement and the women's movement in our society and the leadership that's being demonstrated at the highest levels of government by women, I think the time is right, and it's happening, whether we're ready, whether we like it or not. This new consciousness is being led by women and going on here, and it makes men better in this. We don't have to be on the sidelines. We can be allies, but women, I think, are going to play a central role in the 21st century with healthcare, in particular in the society. I think open-mindedness for revolutionary change going on. We are losing people with opioids, with cancer, with all. Come on now, we can't have time for all reform movements. We have to have the sort of revolutionary changes that you and others promoted with the multicultural competence. And that's where I see us going if we are to remain viable and relevant in the 21st century, given the demographic change. What do you all think?
Yeah, there's one more thing I do want to build on from what you said, Michael. Michael. There's so much going on in higher education right now, focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think sometimes people know what they're talking about, and sometimes it's a head count. Okay, we have to have more diversity. And let's look at the pay scales for women and men and so forth. And inclusion, again, that's the hardest one, because any campus, students of color still don't feel visible or, sufficiently included. But my point here on the DE&I movement is that I don't think it needs more of a foundation in cultural competencies.
Yes.
The whole cultural competency roadmap, because you cannot really have a campus that is operating from a DE&I framework if you do not have cultural competency that goes along.
So there's this doing before being.
Correct.
Right, that is so prevalent.
Yeah, and they'll do a strategic plan for DE&I. It's all behavioral, but how are people going to change? How are people going to be at a decision point to say, yes, let's do that? Do they have that sufficient awareness? Do they have the sufficient cultural knowledge to say, yes, this makes a difference? So that's one of the,
good points.
I probably have to do some talk and write about that.
So I think too, there can be more harm than good if we're not being and we jump to doing.
Oh.
And even in our field, but also I think you're exactly right, in higher ed there were lists. It's this, we gotta have our strategic plan, and it's gotta be on our list, and we wanna increase, and you're hearing, so there's parallels. I remember first starting to read about multicultural movement, and most articles started with by the year 2020, right? And there was the potential fear mongering in some of it, which was also alarming, right? Like, we'll be I don't even think they said majority minority, but
right.
But I think there's that parallel in higher ed right now. Every conference I go to, all the leadership, if you don't start recruiting students of color and retaining them, you will go by the way of these institutions that are closing. But there's something really unjust about that rationale. If this huge percentage of graduates are students of color that are graduating out of 12th grade in the next 15 years, we have to do better. We have to be better, not do better.
Yeah.
Because if we are better, we will do better.
Well, we have to be better to do better. Absolutely. Yeah. Right now, 35% of children under 18 are Latino. I may have the right number. So you look at those data points, and you can't just throw your hands up and say, "Oh my goodness, we can't." The majority of these kids speak English primarily because they're born in the country. So I'm talking about U.S. born kids.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. You can't go off and say, "Well, these are immigrants." I mean, there's a sector that are, but just the majority are born here. 67% of Latinx people are born in the United States. Digest that. People have to digest these realities because, their universities will close.
They will, because if there's no, if you're catering to white students,
or you're not authentically catering to the underrepresented students, I think that's where the authenticity matters. As far as how you do that, how you bring the family into it, the parents into it, because most of these are still going to be first gen students.
Well, you both have talked about the importance of getting better, and today is, it's October 15th, 2019, and certainly we have been made better with you coming to Springfield College, and we really appreciate it. And of course, my colleague and friend here, just make us better all the time. So I'm so glad we got together.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you and Allison for hosting this and being part of this conversation. Really good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.